Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, Staunton campus, and good morning, Head at campus. We're grateful for you guys. And those watching our iCampus today, we're grateful for you too. Open your Bibles with me to 1 Samuel chapter 17. We'll be there throughout this series entitled Giant Killers. Last week was the first message, and we talked about the journey of a giant killer. And if you didn't catch that, you might want to go back and get that off online. Today, we're going to look at that giant killing begins in the mind. But giant killing begins in the mind. So today I want to read I'm going to kind of tell you the story a little bit, just kind of catch you up in case you didn't know the story, because sometimes people don't know the story. But then I'll read kind of some verses in the middle of the story. So David, the end of the story is he kills a giant named Goliath. Giant was 9 foot 9 inches tall, so that's Goliath. And so David was a boy. He's watching sheep. He was invited or asked to go by his father to go and find his brothers who are at the war zone and get some information and bring back. And so David goes, he brings some food, goes to his brothers. He gets there just in time early in the morning for them to go to take their battle lines, okay? Excuse me, sorry about that. So anyway, so as they went to the battle lines, David kind of runs to catch up with them, see what's going on, because that sounds like a good time to do. And so he's just excited to see what's going to happen. And he watched the warriors of Israel kind of come up to the battle lines. They've got all their armor on, and they're shouting their war cry, the Bible says. And then the Philistines come up on the other side of the valley, and they're doing the same thing, and they're shouting their war cry. And then it says that Goliath stepped up. He's the champion of the Philistine army, and he steps up. And as part of their culture would have been that the champion of one army would challenge the champion of another army, and then the two would fight, and then the winner of the two would be the one who determined which army won, right? So that's kind of the thing that was going on. So Goliath would step up, and he would, it says, I'm skipping all these verses because I remember last week and just kind of make it faster, but it says he shouted his usual defiance, in which he'd been doing this before. Well, if you read the story, that they had done this for 40 days already. And they'd done it twice a day, every morning and every night for 40 days. This had happened. This was the 41st day in the morning that the Goliath story takes place, right? So 80 times already they had done exactly what David was witnessing. So they walk up, Goliath shouts his usual defiance, and then instead of like attacking or whatever, the Israelites, they turned around and ran. Like, okay. So we'll do it again tomorrow, I guess, right? Is that kind of a thing? And so David saw that, and it really bothered him. Like, he just couldn't believe it. So these guys got up, put their armor on, went and did their war cry thing. The other guy across the valley yells, and then they go back home. It was just that kind of a deal. So it was a bad situation. So let me pick up in verse 28. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 28. Well, the last part of what I hadn't read to you yet was that, so David comes back and he's like, what the world's going on? And he asks, what is it that Saul would give? Because Saul was promising that whoever would take on the giant, Goliath, he'd give him wealth, and he would give him his daughter's hand in marriage, and his family wouldn't pay taxes. So David was asking questions about that. Verse 28, when Eliab was David's older brother. David's oldest brother heard him speaking with the men. He burned with anger at him and asked, why have you come down here? Now, there's a list of questions. Hear those from the oldest brother to the youngest brother, okay? Or maybe in your house is the sister. Just hear this way this is said. Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those sheep in the wilderness? I mean, hear how condescending that is. I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down here only to watch the battle. David turns to him, verse 29. Now what have I done? Said David. Can't I even speak? Then he turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter. The question of what was it that Saul had said he would give to the person who defeated the Goliath. And the men answered him as before. What David had said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. Now just get the picture for a second. Saul is the king, right? He's the leader of the entire army. He's the commander in chief in that case, right? And he was also a warrior. And now you got this, probably 14-ish age boy who's coming up, and he is the one who's going to say to the warrior king, oh, by the way, don't you guys worry about it, I'll take care of this. Now, you need to get your head around this for a second. The army was full of warriors. These guys had been in battle. These were seasoned veterans, okay? They'd been to war multiple times. I'm not talking about war where you launch something from, 100 miles away. I'm talking about hand-to-hand combat. That's what these guys were, yet they were afraid of Goliath. David, the boy, and this, I'm just going to be honest with you. There's not a 14-year-old boy around here that I want to fight a battle for me. Right? And particularly when the battle is, you'll be the slave to the other guy. There ain't no one in the world that's going to happen. Okay? So just picture, because I don't have time to get into it much, but God's hands through this whole process. I mean, behind the scenes, God is working, not just to give David God confidence to step up, but also working behind the scenes in someone like Saul to give Saul the confidence in the 14-year-old boy to step up. Their message, I'll come back to that in a few weeks. Okay. Verse 32 again. Don't let anyone lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. Verse 33. Saul replied, you're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man. And he is a warrior, has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When the lion or the bear came and carried off the sheep from the flock, I went after it. I struck it. I rescued the sheep from its mouth. And when it turned on me, I seized it by its hair and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. I'm just telling you, between those little sentences right there, there's a lot of stuff that God's doing behind the scene to make that work out. Verse 38. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. He's preparing for battle, in other words. David fastened on his sword over his tunic, and he tried walking around because he was not used to them. You know how that is. Like, if you're trying on a pair of shoes, and what do? You try on a pair of shoes, you kind of walk around a little bit, right? See if they work right. Well, picture the entire, armor for the first time, and now he's just trying to get used to it. Can I maneuver in this? Can I wear this? And David's answer was, I cannot go out in these, he said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand. He chose 5 smooth stones from the stream. He put them in his pouch of his shepherd's bag and had his sling in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over, and he saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing in health and handsome. And he despised him. He said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I will give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. I got to stop there, though I don't want to. Just get ready to get good. Number 1 in the outline. Our internal reality determines our outward expression. Our internal reality determines our outward expression. "40 days, twice a day, warriors put on their armor, left their campsite, went out to the battle line, shouted their war cry 80 times. On the 81st time, a boy sees it for the first time. "80 times, the giant had come out. 80 times, grown men, seasoned veterans of hand-to-hand combat, had witnessed it. He didn't say something new 80 times. It says he shouted his usual defiance. He said the same thing on the second time as he said on the first time. He said the same thing on the 31st time as he did on the 25th time. He said the same thing on the 80th time that he'd been saying on the first 79 times. Yet the internal reality of the soldiers determined their outward expression. So they ran up, right? They got it all on. They're ready to go. You know, whatever their war cry, they did their thing, right? They're all fired up, bumping chests and high-fiving and banging helmets. I don't know, whatever they did, right? They're going to tear them up today. And as soon as he stepped up, that's when their internal reality revealed itself. And their outward expression was to run. And they ran every single time. Matthew chapter 12, don't need to turn to it, but Matthew chapter 12, verse 34, it's a verse that is very helpful if you get your head around it. And what it says is that out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. And the word heart in Scripture is not that thing that pumps inside your chest. It's just your person, right? It's who you are. It's out of the overflow of who you are, how you think, how you feel, how you process, out of who you are is your belief system. Out of the overflow of who you are is what your mouth is going to say. Now, you can get all fired up, okay? You can get all, get the game face on, and you're going to really do whatever it is. You're going to make a difference tomorrow, and you're going to stand up for this, and you're going to overcome that, and you're going to change this. But let me tell you something. What you speak means nothing if what you are doesn't back that up. If who you are as a person, I use the word personhood, right? There's a lot of people who can talk a good game, but their personhood doesn't back it up. Now, time out, let me pause this whole conversation, and let's go back to lots of things we've talked about in the past, and if that's as far away from God as you can never become, and that's as close as Jesus you ever get, right? That all of us are on this continuum someplace. We're all in this taking next step journey process, right? Wherever you are in that journey is not about good or bad. That's not the conversation. Don't get caught up in good or bad. Don't get caught up in, well, I'm not as good as they are. That's not the conversation. The conversation is, where are you? And will you take a next step? Because let's just say that the person back here whose personhood isn't prepared to take on the giant in front of them. That's not bad. It's just where you are. And when you look at someone way down here someplace and their personhood is ready to take on the next giant, right? Well, they're not better than the person back there. They've just taken a lot more next steps. Are you tracking with me? Yes? 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 Head at campus? You tracking with me, head at campus? Right? It's not in campus. You guys tracking? Right? It's like, don't just look at me. You guys just look at me like. Here's the deal. Wherever you are in the journey is only because you've taken next steps. Or only because you haven't taken next steps. Does that make sense? So if you're way down here someplace, you've taken next steps. If you're not as far as you wished you were, it's because you haven't taken next steps. See, spiritual development, emotional development, maturity of all the areas of maturity are not necessarily based on your age. Well, I'm 79 years old. That doesn't make you mature. It makes you old. Right? Right? So, if you were 18 and now you're 35, you're not more mature than you were at 18 necessarily. You're just older than you were. Right? Now, hopefully you have taken steps in maturity. Right? Hopefully you're better with your money at 50 than you were at 20. Right? Hopefully you're better with your relationships at 35 than you were at 15. Hopefully you've matured and developed in your life in some areas as you have aged, but it has nothing to do with time passing. It has to do with taking next steps in that journey. Okay, one of the areas that we fail and we choose to neglect most of the time is our spiritual development journey. That we have to take these next steps. It's the same kind of process. So what happens sometimes is life comes at us. These areas of giants come at us, wherever they may be. And the thing is we're not prepared for those. They stir up our insecurities or our fear or our the things that handicap us or our habits or our addictions or whatever the thing is, and we're just not prepared for that. And then we run back. We don't know what we believe, and we don't know where we stand, and we don't really know where we are with Jesus, and whatever the thing is, and we just back up so many times. And the reality is that the reason we struggle is because our internal reality gives us our outward expression. And we choose fear, and we choose doubt, and we choose worry, and like for instance, I'll use worry for a second. Worry is always the absence of trust in God. You can be concerned about things because things are real sometimes and they're scary. But there's a difference in being concerned and being worried. There's a difference in being concerned and being fearful. There's a difference in feeling fear and doing the right thing and feeling fear and not doing the right thing. The difference isn't what you feel. The difference is, do you have the personhood, do you have the internal reality to do the right thing, to have an outward expression that honors God, or whatever the case may be. So when you find yourself stumbling a lot, when you find yourself in an area of weakness and you fall a lot, when you find yourself coming up against the same wall and you keep, that same barrier, that same thing keeps overwhelming you, or whatever we're talking about. When you find yourself being, the issue is not the thing, the issue is personhood. The issue is the internal reality. Soldiers walk up way more experienced than David. And their internal reality was, oh my gosh, we're overwhelmed. Look how big he is. He's a giant. He's 9 foot 9 inches tall. Look at him. His if you read the thing he's going to throw at them was 35 pounds, right? Or 15 pounds, I mean, that was a spear. He had 125 pounds just of armor hanging on him. This guy was a beast, right? I'm sure his teeth were messed up and his breath was bad, right? He was scary, right? And so you see him, and so you're walking by what you see. You're walking by your sight. It's like, he's big, he's bad, he's scary, he's smelly. I want to stay far away from him because he would tear me to pieces. And David, who didn't have the experience the warriors had, didn't have the equipment the warriors had, his internal reality, he looked at the same scary thing and he went, you defy the armies of the living God. You don't understand what kind of mess you're in. What's the difference? Well, it's just an immature kid, because those grown soldiers, they're realist. Really? Read the story. The soldiers were wrong. Some of us want to live in our doubt, and then our doubt becomes reality. And yes, we're right. And we hang on, I'm right. I've been right every time. It doesn't work that way. This can't change. That can't be different. This won't be overcome. People don't do this. We'll never get past that. And as they live in their what they call realism, their doubt becomes their reality. Their fear becomes their reality. Their safe places become their reality. And it always messes them up when someone steps out in faith, trusts God, and they see God deliver something that's beyond normal. The armies, they were overwhelmed with what they saw. David wasn't. Had nothing to do with maturity. It had nothing to do with experience. It had to do with an internal reality. Number 2 in the outline. Giant killers do not listen to doubting critics. Giant killers do not listen to doubting critics. Now, there's nothing wrong with someone being critical, as in having critical advice or giving suggestions or whatever the case may be. Nothing wrong with that. That's, don't get weird. Like, just because somebody's a critic don't make them bad. But there's a difference in a doubting critic and someone who's just saying, hey, we can make this better, right? I'm going to give you 3 kinds, and then the outline is we must get past the Iliads of life. Okay, that's the first bullet point under do not listen to doubting critics. The Iliads of life are over us emotionally. So we're talking about David in this case. His brother is named Eliab. That's why I use the word Iliads of life, because you probably know no one named Eliab, right? But Eliab was a brother, and he was over him emotionally. Okay? And if you go back to the little story, so the things he said, he's looking at his brother, and he says things like, that is the wrong page. Okay. he says to him things like, he's burning with anger. Okay, so he's got the angry eye thing going. He says, why have you come down here? I mean, just that's loaded, right? You hear the tone of voice when he says it, right? He says, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few? I mean, instead of like that herd of sheep, who did you leave those few sheep? And we're like, I mean, just hear how condescending that stuff is, right? In the wilderness. And I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. I mean, just hear how loaded those sentences are. How, he is trying to belittle, and this is happening in front of people. He is trying to emotionally destroy his little brother, right? In our lives, we have people like that sometimes. There are people who are over us emotionally, or there's situations that are over us emotionally. It's just the emotions of the moment is just overwhelming to us. You will never really be able to keep taking next steps until you can get past those. I mean, you can take next steps to a certain spot, and then it's like, well, you'll never do that. I mean, some of us have people in our families who do that to us. Some of us have, not so much in our family today, some of us are living with tapes from our past, where we hear the voice of a parent, or we hear the voice of whoever, in our past that says what we will and what we won't do, what we can and what we can't do, the kind of person we are or aren't. We hear voices sometimes that come back. It's like this recorder inside of our head, and sometimes the enemy just pushes play, and we hear this tape going over and over. Now, you can't necessarily see that on our faces, but we hear it just as the same. And the voices we hear aren't voices that are picking us up. They're voices that are tearing us down. They're not voices that are breathing life into us. They're voices that are sucking the life from us. They're not speaking life. They're speaking death. They're not speaking hope. They're speaking failure. And sometimes we hear those voices. And I'm just going to tell you, if we don't get past those voices, we'll never be able to kill the giants in front of us. Sometimes the giants we face are over us emotionally. The second area was the kind we have to get past, the Sauls of life. And the Sauls of life are people or things that are over us positionally. It's not an emotional thing so much as just we can't get past the positional level of that. Okay? Well, it's like in the case of Saul, someone had to give David permission to go to battle with Goliath. Okay? So Saul was over him positionally. So let's just say that David was stirred by God to step up, had all the God confidence. The entire story is exactly true the way that it leaves out in Scripture. God's going to do exactly what we know happened in Scripture, but let's just say he got to Saul. Okay, so first of all, he deals with his brother. He got past his brother. If he hadn't got past his brother, if he'd went, oh, okay, sorry, Eliab, I'll go back to the few sheep in the wilderness over here. Sorry, see you later, brother. Okay, if he'd done that, we'd never had the rest of the story. Right? And the realist would have been right. That 14-year-old kid, a few sheep in the wilderness, he ain't got no business taking on. He's not a warrior. He has no experience. He's a punk kid. Get yourself back to taking sheep and babysitting your father. And we'd have had no rest of the story, and the realist would have been right. Okay, he gets past that one, the emotional issue. And now he comes to Saul. He's got to get permission. He's got to get the green light to go forward. He has to get past the one who's over him positionally. He has to work through the process. Because maybe it's not a person, maybe it's a process. Maybe it's some steps you have to take to get to where you need to go, whatever it may be. And he goes to Saul. Now let's go tell you, if we look at it with eyes, human eyes and realistic looking at it, there's no way that the commander-in-chief of an army is going to say to the 14-year-old boy, yeah, sure, go out and fight for us, not a problem. That's not going to happen. So this thing about that David has to go and he has to trust that God's going to work behind the scenes in this person or in this process to put all the things in place to make it happen. I don't have time. I could tell you these stories for hours. I can tell you real stories for hours. And God worked in the heart, the mind, whatever, of Saul. And Saul said, yeah, sure, let's do this. It's a good idea. May God be with you. What? And then there's Goliath. You have to get past the Goliaths of life. The Goliaths are those things that, whether they're over you in ability, or they're over you in what you don't have and they do have, like you have nothing and they have everything. And it might be a person. Don't think about it. It's not necessarily always a person. It could be a person, but maybe it's not a person. Maybe it's just that situation, that circumstance. You don't have what it takes to face that. It's in some form they are over you in the area of intimidation. That they are so overwhelming compared to your lack of ability, your lack of resources, your lack of experience, your lack of whatever we're talking about. And sometimes the only way to deal with those is to step forward in faith and trust God. Now, I don't know that they always go in that certain order, but what I'm going to tell you is this, is that whatever the thing is that you're facing, whatever the giant is that overwhelms, whatever the thing is you have to get past, that thing that's in front of you, that God, because you just take them one at a time. Don't think about what's down the road, but right now, what is it you're facing that you'd call a giant? Maybe it's your apathy. You're just, if you're just honest, you're apathetic. You just don't care. I mean, I want to care, but I don't really care. I'm just, kind of apathetic. I'm just so busy in my little stuff and the life I live and the things I do. I wish I could care like someone else does. I just don't. And, it is what it is and it's okay. And I'll just do the things I do. And okay, so it may not be something we call bad. It's just what we call normal. Maybe your giant is just something normal. But the point is, unless you can get past those kind of doubting critics in your life, the Eliabs, the Sauls, and the giants, the Goliaths of your life, you'll never become a giant killer. Number 3 in the outline, giant killers develop a contagious God confidence. Giant killers develop a contagious God confidence. So when David was facing Saul, the one over him positionally in his life, right? He goes to him, he says, "Hey, Saul." And Saul says, "Dude, you're just a kid, man." Which what we think Saul should say. And David says, okay, let me explain to you. So I watched the sheep, right? I'm watching the sheep, and the bear came, and I hunted the bear down and killed him, right? And what it really says is that, the lion was first, I guess. The lion came, he grabbed the sheep and runs off. I go and I hit him, and he drops the sheep. I grab the sheep, and I'm coming back, okay? And then the lion turns and wants to eat me. So when the lion turned on me, that's what it says in the Bible. The lion turned on me, and then I grabbed him by the hair. So we're not talking about the slingshot thing, right? We're talking about, dude, he came at me. I didn't kill him from 100 yards away with my high-powered rifle and scope, right? It's not very courageous to kill an animal, like a half a mile away, right? Like, okay, the lion can't hurt you here. He grabs him by the hair. And then he killed him. And then the bear, he steals a sheep. And I struck him, okay? And he dropped the sheep and kind of ran off. And then he turned around and came at me too. I grabbed him by the hair and I killed him. Now, those stories, what David is doing, he's telling stories. He's talking about next steps. Yes, I was just a shepherd boy, but then I became a lion killer. And then I became a bear killer. And I'm getting ready to become a giant killer. You see the progress? He's telling stories. And Saul is having faith because of the stories. David just took next steps. Remember, if you go back to last week's message, I think it'll be at the top of the outline you're looking at. It's like the preparation for the giant you want to kill in 5 years from now is beginning today. You're taking next steps. You don't see what's even coming 5 years from now. But if you're prepared for it in 5 years from now, it's because you took next steps way back here someplace in the preparation process. So David was just being David. He's just being a shepherd boy, doing what shepherd boys do. Oh, dadgummit, you either sit there and watch it. Yeah, Dad, we got one less sheep date. Yep, dadgum lions, got to watch those guys. Right? But he didn't. And he was responsible in small things, and then responsible in a few bigger things, and responsible in some really big things. And all of a sudden, he's in a position that when it's time to stand up and face a giant for the slavery or the freedom of an entire nation. I mean, he never had any idea that, just picture this moment. He's in this moment right here, and he's doing this thing right now, and he never realized that thousands of years later, a handsome pastor named Tim would stand on a stage, okay, and tell the story of what he did, right? When he's killing the lion, he wasn't thinking, Tim's going to talk about me someday. This will be awesome. He wasn't doing that. When he killed the bear, he wasn't going, Tim, this is more information for you, brother. This will be awesome. Tim's going to have a good day with this one. He never had a conversation in his mind saying, Okay, God, if I kill this giant, would you just make that story last forever and people just, echo that throughout all eternity? He never did that. You and I don't necessarily know, realize in the moment about the stories that we live and how God wants to use those to echo through all of eternity. How you can be the difference that's made in one person's life. Yes, we'll never be the stories in the Bible, but we are the book of Acts, chapter 17,043,043, or whatever it may be. We are the stories of the act of the Holy Spirit in the lives of individual people who call themselves followers of Christ. And taking next steps matter, and facing down giants matter. All those experienced soldiers, all those realists who looked at the giant and was overwhelmed, they're a footnote. They're an embarrassment part of the story. They may have been beasts in their own right. They may have been monster men. They may have been like, candidates for the movie 300. You know what I'm talking about? They may have been like the Spartans of their time. They may have been awesome. But based on this story, they were weak and pathetic. And it was the 14-year-old boy that God chose to use. A person who chose to believe in him. A person who became a giant killer in their mind long before they became a giant killer in their reality. As he told the story, his God confidence was contagious. I can tell stories for hours. I can sit in a service like this. Obviously, I can't see our campuses and it was online, but I can sit here and tell stories. I can look at if we just said, Tim, go. I can just start on the side. I won't do it for time's sake. Everybody's going, whew. But I can start on the side and I can just start telling stories. I can tell stories specifically about many of you and where you came from and where you are and the journey you're on and choices you've made, conversations we've had. Not all the stories are wins. I've watched some of you chicken out and flinch. I watched some of you be deceived by the enemy and fall. I watched some of you hit home runs and succeed. I watched some of you take next step after 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 next step. I've seen some of you sit in your apathy for a long time. We just go on this, we just all day long. Some of your stories would inspire everyone else in the room if they just knew what you had been through, the journey that you took. If they just knew the process that you had to work through emotionally or work through mentally or work through in your relationships or work through in your finances or work through in your whatever it is to get to the place that you are. If they just understood where you had come from and where you are and where you're headed, if they just understood that, they'd be so inspired. Because see, giant killers are able to tell stories that create contagious God confidence. I talk to pastors and church leaders, and they'll be, when I start telling stories, well, this person came to Christ and that person came to Christ. See, because it's always in reaction to them telling me, well, you can't reach people in small towns. Churches don't grow anymore. We're past the age of Christ, What do they want to say to me? It's all a bunch of garbage. Well, why is it garbage, Tim? Because I got stories. And I just start telling stories. And I can just start, well, last week this happened, and 2 weeks ago this happened, and 3 weeks ago this happened. And what happens is they always get really quiet. And 6 weeks ago this happened. And 8 weeks ago this happened. And a month ago this happened. And last year this was what was going on. And then 2 years before that. And then 3 years before that. And 5 years before that. And 6 years before that. Because the stories are contagious. Because it's not about what people can do. It's what God's willing to do through people who are willing to step up and trust him and walk in faith. The people who are willing to win the battle in their mind first are the ones that God's going to use to overcome giants. Number 4 in the outline. The valley is where your giant has come to die. Just follow through. All the way, and we haven't got that far in the story yet, all the way until the place where the stone hit the giant. David wasn't a giant killer, and it was all talk. Sitting in Saul's tent, awesome. Walking toward the front lines, they had done that. I mean, just think about this for a second. All the soldiers, they had done that already for 40 days, twice a day, 80 times. This was actually done 81 times because they did that morning. This is the evening of the 41st day. This is the 82nd time they had done this exact thing. But they never followed through. David goes down, he got Saul's armor, he got his staff, he got his slingshot. He didn't even have rocks with him. On the way going there, he knelt down by the stream, and he picked up his 5 smooth stones. Anybody who's ever thrown a rock knows the importance of the rocks you pick. Okay, young people, when us old people were growing up, we didn't have, 400 channels on TV, 4,000 channels on TV. We didn't have, we didn't have computers that we call telephones. We had make-believe guns, right? And we had rocks that you pick up and throw at things, right? We did stuff like that. And so we learned that if you pick up a certain rock, it curves. You pick up a different kind of rock, it goes straight. We learned the importance of the kind of rock you pick up. David bit down, he got 5 rocks that were perfect for the job that he had to do. All that's great, but that doesn't finish the deal. He had to follow through. If he'd have flinched at his brother, he wouldn't have been a giant killer. If he'd have flinched when Saul, who was over him positionally, said, nah, we can't do that, he wouldn't have been a giant killer. If he'd have flinched when it was time to face down Goliath himself, the thing that was intimidating, the thing that was over him by what he saw and his abilities and all that kind of stuff he's experiencing, he wouldn't have been a giant killer. But he followed through. The last thing we ended the story with today was his giant screaming intimidation toward him. Looking at him, and it says he despised him. Picture the eyes of a 9'9" person dressed in full robe, messed up, funky teeth, horrible breath. You can see the fumes coming out from, right? Arm hair down to here. Just picture the look, right? Drooling out of the side of his head, who has the eyes of I despise you, and says, I will kill you and feed you to the wild animals right today. He could have flinched and he wouldn't have been a giant killer, and I wouldn't preach about him today. But he didn't. Getting your giant to expose itself, getting your giant to come to a place in the valley where it's there to die is wonderful. It's great. You're all here. Perfect. Having a little kumbaya service and pray a few prayers and sing a few songs and preach a good message and, shake a few hands and whatever it is not what gets her done. At the end of the day, that last phrase is the whole deal. You have to follow through. It was the follow through that took David from a guy who spoke a lot of stuff to a guy who did something that mattered. It was follow through. It all began with how he thought, that in his mind, in his personhood, he believed, his internal reality believed in the God that could do what he said he was going to do. He had taken the thoughts captive. I mean, if you read there's verses I put on the outline, you can read those and they'll tell you this. He took the thoughts captive. The thoughts of, oh my gosh, that guy's scary. Holy smoke, he's big. The closer he gets, he's getting bigger all the time. All those thoughts that he had, you have no control over your thoughts. All that stuff he felt, he had to get past. He had to take those thoughts captive. He had to take those emotions captive. He had to make them obedient to the lordship of Christ, is what the scripture says there. But obedient to what he knew God was speaking in him. Just so he could step up and do the one thing God asked him to do in that moment. So the question I got for you today is what's the thing God's asking of you? What's your next step? What's this overwhelming giant? And maybe it's just getting past your apathy. Maybe it's trusting God in some area, some decision of your life. I don't know. Maybe you are facing down something that is over you emotionally or over you positionally or something that's intimidating you out. You just can't imagine how horrible this thing is. I don't know. But what I can tell you is that if you don't win the battle of how you think, then you'll never win the battle of how you feel. If you don't win the battle of how you think and how you feel, your emotions and the lies that you hear will deceive you into living a life of failure, living a life of mediocrity, living a life where you live forever at this end of the stage, where you're always in what could have been if you just taken a few next steps, where the next step of whatever God's asking you to do is just more than you can take. And so you're just going to sit right here. And you wonder, why am I struggling with the same things I've always struggled with? You wonder, why am I going through the same, whatever it is, cycle that I keep going through? I keep repeating the same thing over and over and over and over. I keep going through it. Why? It's because you're not taking next steps. If I could just have a prayer, it fixed it. It don't work that way. Follow through with your next step. Don't follow through with 10 steps up. There's 9 steps between here and there. Taking a step. Taking a step. And then one of these days when you're up here and you've walked through a whole herd of giants and a whole herd of emotional things and physical things and positional things and intimidating things, you'll be up here and someone looks at you and says, they're a giant killer. And they'll hear your story. And God will give them the confidence to believe in their story. Because your story will be so contagious of how you took next steps and how God provided and how God protected. Will never be in the Bible. But I want people in generations to come to talk about what we did here. But what God did where he planted us at. But what God did in our individual lives and what God did in our lives of our church corporately. Our church family, all of our campuses. That all the people who said that can't happen have to shut up because God just did what they kept saying couldn't take place. Not in one location, but in lots of locations. Over and over and over again for years and years and years back to back. Let's pray. Dear Father, God, I pray you've stirred hearts. I pray that you've really clarified not what I had to say, but God, what you're speaking in us. God, whether it's a person that's watching online in their home or driving down the road or at a hospital or God, they're in one of our campuses or they're here in the room in the Carlinville campus, God, I pray that your Spirit has just, you brought that one thing that just kind of popped up and said, this is the thing I want you to deal with. This is how this message applies to this one area. And God, I pray you give us a next step to take. God, I can't imagine the spiritual authority and power if 600 people just took one step at the same time. Just whatever the next step is, we just took that next step for me as a person. God, we just keep taking next steps for your glory, for your plans, for your purposes. God, to create a culture of redemption where you've planted us at. God, I pray that our story, individually and corporately, I pray our stories inspire confidence in you from those who are watching from a distance. We love you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Let's